whatever you said in my absence. I'm going to talk about the history of treatment of mental disorders, and I'll try not to be a presentation of historical facts and figures also alone, because it's very easy to find narrations of history in textbooks. The question is whether we can learn anything from history, and if things that we can learn can deepen our understanding of our current knowledge, and whether we're able to predict things of the future by understanding the past. So there seems to be always a chain of events. Often this chain of events seem to be unrelated to each other. But there is also some important hidden message in this chain of events that leads to an innovation, and it is the rare exception that discoveries happen by chance. I remember that in school, in high school and in elementary school, a very common way of teaching history was that by chance they found something. By chance they observed something. This is the rare exception, although we teach it as the rule. And why does this happen? This happens because it is much more pleasant for the average general public, and also often it is very convenient because people who gave their names in the discovery of things, often they keep out of sight some dark aspects of their effort, like breaking copyrights, stealing ideas, or putting people in the corner and taking all the advantage, all the spotlights of publicity and fame on themselves. Such an example is penicillin and Fleming. Fleming was probably the one who least contributed to the development of penicillin. But if I ask anybody of you here who was the inventor of penicillin, you will reply Fleming. Also Edison and electricity. Today, the electrical systems are based on Tesla theory, not Edison. But everybody knows Edison and not Tesla. And this thing with these two people is because both Fleming and Edison were masters of the mass media of the time. So this is a recurring pattern in the history of innovation, and also affects the history of mental treatments development. So what I want to stress here is that it was the painful chase and the hard labor of people who led to these innovations. And these innovations are miraculous, in spite of the fact that today we are not satisfied with what we have in hand. We must think where from we started and where are today. We started in the late 19th and early 20th century with big asylums stocked with people. And today we are talking about rehabilitation. It's night and day. It's not absolutely satisfactory, but it's a huge progress. So the history of psychiatric therapeutics in many aspects reflects the attitudes of the society towards madness, towards insanity. And it reflects two major things. The first is whether society invests in the well-being and humanity of patients, or on the contrary, it invests on their isolation and restraint. There are two different, often balancing, but generally two different opposing aspects. And also, it reflects the changing concept of mental illness. We should be aware that psychiatry comes, modern psychiatry in modern times, comes from alienists, and alienists were doctors of the asylums. So psychiatry started with schizophrenia, with the asylum in saints. Then it went on to drug abusers in the late 19th, early 20th century. And today, after the with the second half of the 20th century, it deals more with what we call common mental disorders, which is mild depression, personality disorders, and some maybe more psychological rather than psychiatric conditions. Also, therapeutics reflect a number of ideological and philosophical issues, including what we consider our place in the world and within society. What is our place in the world and society? What is our values? And what we wish for our common future for the development of our society and the world. So it's a deeply philosophical feature issue in many aspects. So if we start with pure history and start with the antiquity, the earliest psychiatric treatment we know is trephination, and trephination started something like 5,000 years BC. We have some skulls, especially from the Peru, and these skulls, as you can see, they have signs of healing around the cut, which means that these people survived at least enough so the bone developed. And here is the famous painting by Hieronymus Bosch, the removal of the stone of insanity from the head of a patient. But of course, we all know that during the classic antiquity in ancient Greece and Rome, there were the worship of Asclepius, and Asclepius had 5 daughters, Hygia, Iaso, Acheso, Egli, and Panakia. These 4 daughters, health, healing, therapy, prestige, and Panakia. Panakia is a medication that treats everything. So these 5 daughters reflect aspects of medicine. Romans had a 6th daughter for Asclepius that was Mediterrina, reflecting the use of herbs and lay persons' treatment options. Also, we know about the snakes which were freely moving in the floors of Asclepion, and they gave their image in the logo of medicine today. The general approach was a mixture of religious rituals, interpretation of dreams for the first time, and also the use of the theory of human body humors. Their imbalance was suggested to lead to mental disorders, so if you used enemas or induce vomiting, then these humors would balance again and health will return. It is interesting to see the myth of Jason and Medea and the expedition in the Caucasus area. Jason in Greek means the healer, and Medea has a name which has the same root as Mede, which was the ancient Greek name for the Persian Empire. Also, it comes from the Greek verb mideo, which means I take care and I organize. So what this myth could say is that healers from Greece took knowledge from the barbarians from the Caucasus era, from the Black Sea, and brought back both a primitive form of medicine plus social organization, a primitive way of healthcare. It is interesting that Jason left Medea for the sake of Glafka, and Glafka is the bird of wisdom of goddess Athena. So the healer left the pagan way, the barbarian pagan way of primitive medicine for some kind of scientific ways and knowledge. In general, in the Greek-Roman world, there was an admixture of religion, philosophy, and practicality, and there were three major psychological treatments in the Hippocratic medicine: inducing sleep, interpreting dreams, and using words to persuade, some kind of primitive psychotherapeutic method. It is said that Asclepiades from Bithynia was the first to free the insane from their confinement, from the chains, which is an event celebrated in the early 19th century. In India, we have similar theories of that of the humorous theories of Hippocrates. What is interesting is that for the first time in Indian text, shocking of the patient is recommended. And I'm mentioning this because shocking the patient starts at some time 200 or 300 years BC for the first time, and it is a concept which is almost believed until today. In ancient China, we had the imbalance of yang and yin, which is again a reflection of human fluids and in accord with the universe, the cosmos, and the earth. In Hebrew, it was a purely religious approach. And it is interesting that also in Persia, and Persia was a rather sophisticated society. Again, in Persia, we have only religious approaches to mental health. During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we had a domination, of course, of religious and metaphysical approaches with treatment including from exorcisms to confession, to folk remedies, to esoteric medicines. And at some time, there was a combination between religious approaches and scientific treatments, because monasteries were developed from purely religious establishments to some kind of quasi-scientific centers. So healers were both monks and doctors of some time, and they used a combination of religious and scientific treatments. The Arab scholars mainly copied and reproduced earlier knowledge, while in the Byzantine Empire, we have, for the first time, the establishment of what is called xenones, an early form of hospitals. In Western Europe, we had the first asylums. The first was probably in Valencia in 1409. This is what it is formally written in textbooks, but probably the first one was established in Hamburg in 1375. The word asylum, of course, comes from the Greek word asylon, which means a place which is sacred and nobody can trespass. In Byzantium, however, was the first psychiatric department, and in Constantinople there was a big hospital called Xenon Pantocrator, a huge hospital. There is nothing remaining today, not even its regulation, but we know, and this is impressive, that it had a separate neurological and a separate psychiatric department. It had 2 priests on duty round the clock, and it also provided medical treatment in combination with some kind of religious consultation. Later in England, we have the Bethlehem Hospital, which is later called the Betham, and the Petit Chapelier in Paris. There was a legislation in France which put the foundations for the first sectoralization of the country in the 17th century. So this legislation demanded that there would be a huge asylum in every section of the time. And a dominating attitude of the time, a dominating belief, was that patients can freely choose between rational and insanity. So what can we do to force them to choose rationality? We should shock them. This is the ancient Indian approach, shocking the patient. So they developed a number of treatment options to shock the patient and force him to come to his minds. You can see the spinning chair. I don't have a laser. So we have a spinning chair here and a seclusion chair, tranquilizing chair, which prevented the patient from seeing, hearing, and moving, so it was getting tranquilized. These were the treatment options of the time. But in the modern age, we have an event which is much celebrated, as I said, freeing the insane from their chains. However, the asylums were, at that time, they were full not only with crazy people, with insane people, but with any kind of people with problems with the law, poverty, orphans, whatever. The conditions within asylums were completely horrible, and it is not exactly known what historically happened. For example, there is some dispute that Pinel ever did what is depicted in this specific painting. However, it is a fact that Vincenzo Ciaruggi in Italy, in Santa Maria Nuova, and Bonifacio in Florence, they freed the insane from confinement for the first time in modern history. At that time, however, asylums were using a number of different approaches to keep under control and to try to have some kind of treatment with patients with sedatives, opium grains, and laudanum, and also alcohol. Even Thomas Sydenham was recommending these substances, hypnosis by Mesmer, and also we have this jacket, you know, this straight jacket. It was in use since the 16th century. We don't know really who designed it and who used it for the first time. An important evolution for science in general, but for psychiatry in particular, was the introduction of taxonomy and classification by Linnaeus in Sweden. Linnaeus classified animals and plants. This is an old idea which has its roots in Aristotle's, the Scala Hierarchica of Aristotle's, with non-living matter at the basis and humans at the top of the pyramid. But this was an incomplete and philosophical classification. Linnaeus did a scientific classification, and this created a wave of enthusiasm because it was considered that this was a tool that could help people to classify disorders, to classify diseases, and by classifying, you could find ways of treatment and etiopathogenetic factors and risk factors. Pinel introduced the moral treatment of insanity, and also in the early 19th century, we had the rational psychotherapy and the introduction of the term psychiatry by Johann Ryle, whose name was also given in a structure of the brain, the Ryle Insel. Also, we have the first psychiatric journal at that time. In the 19th century, the major evolution is that non-restraint is established formally and by law the standard of care. Until that time, the standard of care was confinement and seclusion. Now, the standard is non-confinement and non-restraint and seclusion. In 1843, we have the first decision by court, non-guilty by reasons of insanity. It was a murder case. A Scottish man killed one of the secretaries of the king and was judged not guilty by means of insanity by the court. It was a very important case because also the victim was a very important man of the British society at that time. It is interesting that we have the Utica crib. The Utica crib was a horrible cage, a very narrow cage for agitated persons. And for the first time in the mid-19th century, we have the use of lithium treatment introduced into medicine. We start here with uric acid detected in the bloodstream of patients with uric arthritis. Then there was a concept that mania is an uric disease of the brain. So if we need to remove uric acid from the brain, and how we can do this? If you put uric acid from patients, from the joints of patients with uric arthritis into water, and you also drop lithium in this water, then uric acid dissolves in water. So what we need to do is to give people drink lithium for uric arthritis, but also for mood disorders. This was a completely wrong way of thinking, but still it worked. This is the Utica crib. It was held responsible even for deaths. Imagine an agitated patient secluded like this. He could easily die from a number of somatic factors. In the late 19th century, a number of other compounds is put into use, like Atropa belladonna, mandragora. One important development was the hollow needle and the syringe in the 1953. So it is now easy to use opium intravenously, which is something it is recommended by Krafft-Ebing as a treatment option for mental patients. At that time, also, we have the introduction of the term psychotherapia from the Greek word psyche, which is soul. Originally, it's the butterfly, but it means soul, literally, and therapy. The first community psychiatry hint was mentioned in 1959 by George Robinson, followed by a number of other compounds like bromide, chlorhydrate, paraldehyde, and a number of beverages with lithium circulating around in the free market. It is important to say that at the late 19th century, early 20th century, there were a number of beverages like 7-Up, which originally included lithium, and Coca-Cola originally included cocaine. These were removed cocaine from Coca-Cola in 1912 and lithium from 7-Up a little bit later. But a number of beverages and healing compounds were circulating freely in the market, promising everything, removing uric acid from the system, brightening the mood, whatever. The first use of lithium was, as I said, in the mid-19th century, but in 1871, Alexander Hammond was the first to use lithium as a specific psychotropic agent on the basis of the concept that mania is an uric acid disease of the brain. And in general, the problem with the late 19th century is that we experienced the darkest period of psychiatry. All the treatments used by that time, especially the moral treatment of Morel and all the efforts to treat mental patients had largely failed. So what happened for the second time was that asylums became big prison-like institutions with prisoners having conducted no crime. There were insane people inside, prostitutes, poor people, orphans, whatever you can imagine at the side, at the periphery of society, excluded from normal social life. So the main issue with this asylum big institution was discipline of this huge crowd rather than treatment or returning back to the society. This is the darkest hour of psychiatry. It seemed that the Enlightenment and its ideology and care for humanity has failed in psychiatry. And at that time, however, some sparks started to brighten darkness. In 1883, we have the synthesis of the phenothiazine nucleus, which would later give birth to antipsychotics. We have the concept of receptors in 1890, amphetamines in 1893. Deep sleep therapy is something that many colleagues discuss even today. Put him to sleep, and through sleep he will calm down and wake up another person. This was introduced by Neil MacLeod in Shanghai for the treatment of opium addicts in 1896. However, a number of peculiar theories and practices, some of them rather brutal, also existed at that time. For example, they were using aggressive surgery to remove any tissue that could be responsible for some kind of inflammation. For example, gynecological surgery. Here we have a bias against females because it was believed that hysteria and the female genital organs play some kind of role in mental diseases in females, and also if you catch in your mind the conditions of hygiene in asylums, all these women would suffer from a number of infections from teeth to genitals. So aggressive surgical operations to remove any possible site of infection, including female genitals, were applied, of course, with a huge failure to treat the underlying mental conditions. Psychoanalysis is introduced in the change of the century by Sigmund Freud, and psychoanalysis is what heralds the coming of the 20th century, followed by psychobiology by Adolf Meyer a few years later. Kraepelin makes the first step towards the current nosological approach, and Wagner-Jaurek in 1917 induced malaria fever for the treatment of syphilis. We should note here that a large number of patients chronically treated in asylums were syphilitic patients rather than schizophrenics. We have also narcoanalysis and electronarcosis as add-on to psychoanalytic therapy, and we have the Little Arbet experiment by John Watson. Here we can see hydrotherapy, which was very popular at that time. Both cold and hot water depends on the preferences of the therapist, both as steam, as bathing water, or as something that hurts. And again, we have the shock of the brain as a theory. This is, again, I say, this is a recurrent theme, shocking. And this reemergence of the shock theory by Constance Pascal in 1926 gave rise, in the long term, to electroconvulsive therapy. The first efforts to induce shock was spinning chairs and seclusion, but then we had insulin shock therapy and other methods to induce shock, especially to induce epileptic fits, and eventually, as I said, it led to the electroshock. And this is important because in many textbooks you can read the history of electroconvulsive therapy as a more or less lucky guess, something that happened by random. It did not happen by random. It happened because Manfred Sakel used insulin to shock the patient by inducing hypoglycemic coma and epileptic fits, and Ladislav Meduna used the cardiazol treatment also to induce shock. The problem is that by inducing epileptic fits by means of insulin or cardiazol, this was a horrifying experience, and cardiazol specifically triggered epileptic fits weeks or months after treatment, so it was not a proper way of treatment. A proper way would be to induce epileptic fits by means of electricity. And eventually we need to say that in spite of the early enthusiastic reports on the usefulness of insulin treatment, there was a number of studies in the late 60s that rejected its efficacy. We all know the lobotomy induced by Egas Moniz. Again, he received Nobel Prize in 1948, and lobotomy was trivialized by Walter Freeman in the 60s and 70s. The ice-pick lobotomy, you can see through the nasal cavity. He was able to access very easily the prefrontal area and cut the fibers connecting the prefrontal lobe with the basal ganglia. Electroconvulsive therapy in 1938 by Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini. They didn't receive the Nobel Prize because of a matter of administrative issues and also because of conflict between the two of them. And then, after the Second World War, John Cade was an Australian GP who was taken prisoners after the siege of Singapore by the Japanese. He spent some 3 or 4 years in a Japanese camp of war prisoners and experienced a huge number of post-traumatic stress disorder. And after the war, he experimented with the use of lithium to treat these conditions. He gave lithium and reported the first beneficial treatment cases, but also the first death from lithium toxemia some 8 months after the starting of lithium treatment. At that time, there was also a bitter conflict between somatic therapists and psychoanalysts, which led eventually to Menninger writing articles in the lay press against ECT. Also, there was a split in the British Psychoanalytical Society between Kleinian and Freudian, and there was a third party, some kind of independent. The emergence of the ICD, and a hidden history is that in 1949, a paper from India suggesting a new treatment for essential hypertension on the basis of Rauwolfia serpentina. We do not have the full names of these people. We do not have their photos. Still, they are lost but not forgotten heroes of medical history. And then we have, in 1952, the first DSM. John Cade, as I said, introduced lithium, later confirmed its efficacy by Morgan Scow and Paul Christian Bastrup. The first proper ECT in psychiatry was conducted by Louis Lasagna, who was the father of American pharmacology in 1952. And the second half of the 20th century is considered to be the psychopharmacological era. This is not true. Psychopharmacology started in the 1850s, as early as 1871, when Alexander Hammond used lithium. However, usually and by consensus, we consider the beginning of psychopharmacology to have happened with the introduction of chloropromazine. And there are mainly three persons involved in the development of chloropromazine. That was Henri Laborie, Pierre Deniker, and Jean Delay. Again, there was no Nobel here. And there was no Nobel because of bitter conflict between them, between the two and the first. It is completely unknown why Laborie, who was a surgeon, insisted in the use of chloropromazine for the treatment of mental patients. And also, there was a group of psychiatrists from the military hospital in Paris who published a paper weeks later after Delay and Deniker on the same subject, and they're completely unknown to the general public. Probably these people were the first to use chloropromazine for the treatment of psychotic patients, and Delay and Deniker copied their idea. What is generally said is that they took the surgery method of Laborie, who was conducting some kind of cryosurgery by putting sacks of ice around the body of the patient and then performed surgery. So they copied the whole procedure by putting people in bath tubes full of ice and giving them chloropromazine. And at some time, the institution could not supply so much ice, and during weekends, the nurses were giving chloropromazine alone. This is the official history, but probably, as I said, this is not really true. So this is the chronological table for the development of antipsychotics and antidepressants. And here we have a detailed table of what is the major evolutions in the late 20th century. I think you can find everything in standard texts. What I want to stress here is that we had a number of political events, like social and political uprising in France in 1968, which put a very heavy scar on French psychiatry. And then we had a dispute on the efficacy of antidepressants, and more recently, we have a similar dispute on the efficacy of antipsychotics. This was not contained within the scientific community, but it also affected the general public with a series of films. The most well-known with 5 Oscars is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was a gravestone for the ECT. And you can see the psychiatrist who also starred in this film, embracing the apparatus which sprayed water on patients. And it's the same apparatus that the huge Indian ripped off the floor and throw it against the window to break the glass and escape away. And also we experience the development of a number of groups against psychiatry, with the more aggressive being Scientology, which has also come to Southern Europe and Greece recently, with a number of objections in their agenda against psychiatry. It is generally an anti-psychiatric movement, not exactly the way Sades was conceiving and writing for anti-psychiatry, but a more postmodern anti-psychiatry agenda. We also experience the infiltration of the pharma industry in scientific decisions with advertisement, like this is my favorite advertisement, it washes your blues away, for fluoxetine. And this is the media for the antidepressant case. And the question is where we are and what is the future from now on. What can we say? What is our understanding of the past and what is the prediction for the future? Well, it's difficult to say, but what we can have as a conclusion is that current models of etiopathogenesis are exhausted. If we are talking about the dopaminergic hypothesis of schizophrenia, we have antidopaminergic drugs. Probably this is what we can have. We can have agents with less side effects, but probably not with better efficacy. The same is for SSRIs, serotonin, and depression. The same holds true for psychotherapies. If psychotherapies work to the extent we believe they are, we are currently discussing whether we can use them through the internet to access more people and to distribute psychotherapeutic services throughout the community. If internet approaches are as good as face-to-face methods, okay, that's it, but it's not better than formal psychotherapy. So our current models of etiopathogenesis and treatment are exhausted, and we are distilling very, very minor things to have a better distribution of these methods to the general pool of patients. What can be done is that we need better research testing of treatment options. There is a number of naturalistic and epidemiological studies that maybe put more fog than clarify things. We need open access to raw data. It is rather unacceptable that we do not have raw data access to clinical trials happened 10 or 15 years ago, and at any case, the patents have are not no longer valid. So the pharma industry has no real benefit from keeping these raw data secret. Also, there is a movement suggesting that if there is a compound that is approved for the treatment of a specific disorder, then for this specific compound, the specific raw data that were used for labeling in the FDA and the EMA should be publicly available. We need better treatment options. Better treatment options will come from better or from new models of etiopathogenesis. Currently, I have nothing new in my head. And we need better management of sociocultural issues and civil rights. It is the question of where is the threshold from mental health to mental disorder? Where are the rights of patients to refuse treatment? What happens with involuntary admissions? And what happens with forensic issues? Thank you very much.